Here's a subject that we all kind of worry about and know nothing about: Korea.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Now listen, I'm a little assumptive talking about all of us, and I'm sure you know a little bit that there is a North and there is a South, and some of you maybe have been to the South, which is very Americanized, but the North certainly isn't. And the North is one of our biggest worries when it comes to our national security, if not the biggest worry. There's probably a contest going on between that which is what we know as terrorism and that which we know as the actors and chief actor in North Korea. And so it's a subject that I think a lot of us yearn to understand and love to avail ourselves to the right kind of dialogue. And we've got a terrific guest tonight from the Naval War College, but who has terrific experience across the board studying with an expertise in South Korea specifically, but you can't be an expert in South Korea without knowing what the heck is going on in North Korea. They're a little bit more closed, if you know what I mean. Here's a headline that's kind of interesting. Donald Trump considering China sanctions over North Korea. So now his friend, the president of China, is getting a little bit of Trumpian muscle here because I guess that Florida dinner didn't go as well as he was hoping in terms of pressure on North Korea. Of course, the South Korean president is continually trying to figure out if Donald Trump is a reliable partner here. He had a short Q&A with Norah O'Donnell at CBS recently, this past week.
Why would Kim Jong-un ever agree to freeze his nuclear weapons program? What are you going to give him?
우선은
Kim Jong-un currently has a blind faith that his nuclear and missile programs will protect him and his regime, and so we must show and teach North Korea that this belief is incorrect. If North Korea gives up its nuclear program and missile programs and wants to start a dialogue, then I believe we can send a message that we will not threaten Kim Jong-un's regime, and we can even provide assistance to them. And that is why I fully agree with President Trump that we need stronger sanctions and pressure on North Korea to the level that we have never reached before, maximum pressure.
The professor is here from the Naval War College. He speaks for himself, not from the Naval War College, which is a disclaimer that we use for all the brains down there. Welcome, Professor. Great to see you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Professor Roehrig is an expert in this Korean thing. I have to laugh, though. Not that it's funny, but kind of like, the notion that if the North gives up its missiles and its nuclear program, then hey, we'd be easy on them. I mean, is that not an impossible ask at this particular juncture, or am I missing it?
Well, we certainly have said on a number of occasions that if they would in fact move to denuclearize and as well restrain their ballistic missile program, that there would be all sorts of aid programs and things to help the North Korean economy and such. But I think at this point, the likelihood that North Korea is going to give up its nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, is a pipe dream. And so we have to decide where we go from there, because the options are just not very good in dealing with the regime, because North Korea believes that it needs its nuclear program to protect the Kim family regime, and it is not going to give those up.
I always, and of course this is as ridiculous a thought as any, but I always think, you know, on those days that they fancy themselves with the parade and almost throw every military arsenal that they've got in that parade, that we could just zap them on that particular day and end the whole situation, you know. But of course, you know, they do flaunt. They love to flaunt their military muscle, don't they?
Sure, and I would say that there are probably two general reasons for that. One, there is domestic politics. I mean, Kim Jong-un has to show his credentials to the military, to the party, to the country as well, and demonstrate his power and muscle, if you will. But also, while we are trying to deter them, they are also trying to deter us by demonstrating what their military capabilities are. Now, certainly they have often made threats that they don't have the capability to carry out. But nonetheless, they're trying to deter us just as much as we are trying to deter them.
Let's go backwards for a second. Your expertise is in this region. You've been studying them for how long now?
Oh, 30 years.
Because?
It's a long story, but it just has become an interest of mine a number of years ago.
Because you can, I mean, elaborate.
Well,
I think people
sure.
would like to know. Sure.
Well, the story is I was a high school teacher in my first career, and I had a chance to go to South Korea for 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time there, I just became very, very interested in all things Korea. And when I came back, went to graduate school, and it has been history ever since in my interest in Korea.
Well, good. History is important here. Rather than just getting into the middle of the sandwich and discussing what we need to do now and what we're concerned about in the future, let's go backwards in history, whatever you think is the relevant start discussion here, for the perspective on how we end up where we are today with North and South Korea. Once upon a time.
Sure. I mean, the bulk of Korea's history is as a united country. At the end of World War II, I should back up, from 1910 to 1945, Japan occupied Korea as part of the Japanese Empire. When World War II came to an end, we had to come up with some way of dealing with the Japanese military that was stationed in Korea. And so the United States proposed to the Russians a plan that we would accept the Japanese surrender south of the 38th parallel. They would accept the surrender of the Japanese north of the 38th parallel. And for all of our intents and purpose was to reunite the peninsula after this was accomplished. But the Cold War was already getting quite intense, and after numerous rounds of talks, we were not able to bring the two parts together. The issue was taken to the UN, and the Security Council voted on a unification plan along with elections that would reunite the peninsula. But the Soviets and the North Koreans did not go along with that plan, and we stayed divided. And then, of course, the Korean War comes in, and we have a solidification of the division of North and South Korea. But Koreans will tell you that, you know, this was a tragedy, that Korea was not Germany. Germany started World War II and deserved to be divided, but from a Korean perspective, they were a victim and did not deserve to be divided.
Which Koreans will tell you that?
Oh, all Koreans
All
will tell you. I mean, you talk to anyone in the North and South, and they will say that the ultimate goal here is reunification of all Koreans together under a single government. Now, of course, the problem is that's not going to happen under North Korean control, and the South is certainly going to have a difficult time getting the North to reunify as well. And so I think it's likely you're going to have a divided Korea for quite a few years.
Is there a lot of commonality between North and South Koreans? I'm not just talking about you know, ethnicity here. I'm talking about family. I'm talking about relationships. Are there broken homes still with a wall between them?
Yes. One of the tragedies of the division and bad relations over the last number of years has been that the divided families have not been able to reunite. We have had on a few occasions family reunions where for a weekend you will have South Koreans being chosen by lottery who have family members in the North to go to designated areas where they can have very carefully controlled reunions, controlled by the North Koreans, to meet up with family members, and just some very heart-wrenching, sad stories.
Do you know what the proportionality is of that dynamic? In other words, how much of the population in either the North or the South has family to the North or the South that they're relatively detached from?
Yeah, I don't have any specific numbers to give you, but there are at least several hundred families that is the case.
Well, that would be a small number.
Right, out of millions. But I think the other thing that you got to that was, or you mentioned in your question, that was very interesting is that as the generations continue and the Koreas remain separated, you are seeing already in the South more and more the younger generations being less interested in reunification. That's not been their experience.
They don't miss
not
anybody.
Connected. That's right. And so you talk about national identities, and South Koreans, again, particularly younger folks, increasingly see themselves as South Koreans, not Koreans. And I wouldn't be surprised if we go another 20, 30 years of a divided Korea, it's going to be even more difficult to to reunify the Koreas, just from those perspectives.
So even though they look and sound the same, they don't. The commonality is increasingly not there.
I think so, and even in language, I have heard South Koreans say that when they speak to North Koreans in negotiation sorts of scenarios, or even when they talk to defectors and such, there are some significant language differences that make it increasingly difficult to understand as well.
So, well, you know, with that backdrop, we'll talk about what's happening now and what our options are. Stay with us.
The North Korean regime receives hundreds of millions of dollars per year from the fruits of forced labor. Responsible nations simply cannot allow this to go on, and we continue to call on any nation that is hosting workers from North Korea in a forced labor arrangement to send those people home.
Professor, you have a thought on the Secretary of State, who really carries a very quiet stick? I mean, he really, in contrast to the President, he seems to be really smart about how he engages, in the sense that he knows that Donald Trump wants to be the star. He seemingly is very effective when he speaks. What's your take?
Well, I think when you look at all of this, it comes back to the difficulty of other options that are available. I mean, Tillerson came out very clearly about the Obama administration policy that, as it's usually classified, strategic patience, and that it hasn't worked. And yet, when the administration has done its policy review, it's not that much different from what the Obama administration had.
You call it Coke. It seems to me it ends up being Coke and Pepsi in a lot of ways. It's still cola.
Some matters of emphasis, I think, is how I would describe it. But there are just very few other options you can take. Military options that have been at least thought of in the early days of this administration, and perhaps others, are very, very dangerous given how close Seoul is.
Okay, so let me go back to another start point here. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being really, really the most worried you could be about the status of the dynamic in North Korea as it pertains to both South Korea and us and the region, how worried are you right now about the way things are going?
Well, it's certainly
give me a number. I mean, ballpark.
A number. I would say the number fluctuates, and when you look at, for example, during the spring, the number is certainly a bit higher. But I tend to be more optimistic that I believe with cool heads deterrence will prevail, in that we have been able to deter the North Koreans for the last 60 plus years. I think that is going to be able to be maintained. North Korea understands that if it uses a nuclear weapon in any sort of offensive fashion,
game over.
Invades the South, game is over. And the gloves come off, and this the Kim regime would be in great trouble.
All right, so Kim Jong-un likes to fire missiles. He likes to test. He hasn't done anything the last few weeks or a month or so, but he was in rapid fire, and that's the spring that you're referring to, right?
Right.
You know, just trying to flex his muscles. I think the pedestrian question everybody wants to know is he crazy? You think he's crazy?
I mean, I would say that the Kim regime is often portrayed as being irrational, but I think they are very, very calculating in regards to what they do. Now, does that mean they don't make mistakes? Certainly. Being rational doesn't mean you don't make mistakes, but I think we are very wrong in dismissing the Kim regime as being irrational.
When you say regime, tell me, how deep does the actual decision-making go? I mean, our view in the cursory reporting that we get lends us to believe that he's running the show, and he's got enough guys around him that obviously are there to protect his interest and the family's interest. They're all kind of watching each other. I actually wonder how they sleep at night. You know what I mean? Just because of what they're always kind of defending against. But how deep is the flow of real independent decision-making going on in the regime?
Well, and certainly...
Or is this kid running the whole show? You know?
Well, he certainly has ultimate veto power, and he does dominate decision-making in North Korea. But it is more pluralistic than we sometimes think. I mean, it's not a single dictatorship. There are power centers within the military, within the party, within the state, within the security system. And so those elements are all part of this mix, but he is ultimately the top decision maker. Now, I think the other way to think about this is that there is a 1 to 2% of elites within the party, within the military, that are doing quite well in this regime and receive a great deal of the economic largesse from Kim Jong-un, and why some of the flows of the economy are important for Kim to be able to reward these loyalists. And many of them live in Pyongyang, where you have to have formal permission to be able to stay. So those folks do fairly well within the regime, but the large part of the North Korean population does not do so well.
Does he have trouble sleeping at night, or do you think he's comfortable?
Oh, I think he's pretty comfortable, but now, you know, there is certainly a Game of Thrones element that's going on here on a fairly regular basis. He's got 3 very capable security organizations that are interlocking, that make sure elites and others are loyal to Kim Jong-un, and there are certainly great punishments if you are caught and not so.
Right.
So,
And
you
to-
know,
and
he
to
does
that-
a pretty good job of that, I mean, from his standpoint.
And to that point, the rest of the population, the other 99.9 or whatever % of the population, which seems to be incredibly suppressed, you know, going around their business more or less with their independent liberty hands tied behind their backs. Is there a spring awakening coming from that population, or are they so pinned down that they'll never rise up?
I wouldn't say never, but I think we're a long way from that. And I would say 2 things. One, the general population is still raised from young on to revere the regime, to revere the Kim family, loyalty, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that is breaking down slowly as information is able to seep in through illegal sources.
They're not on the internet, the general population.
There is an intranet, and there is reportedly 2 to 3 million North Koreans that have cell phones, but within a North Korean enclosed network. But there are also flows of illegal thumb drives, DVDs, cell phones that are allowing contact to Chinese towers, movies from South Korea, from China, from the United States that are showing people the outside world. And so that is starting to slowly break down that information control.
It's amazing.
The other key piece I would add is Kim Jong-un maintains a very, very tight coercive control over people and their ability to express themselves. You mentioned and touched on the human rights issues, and certainly we got a very sad glimpse of that in the Otto Warmbier story. But for North Koreans, they have to live under that regime and the control and the oppression all the time. And that's a very sad thing. The UN in February of 2014 came out with a very nasty report on the nastiness of the North Korean regime, and it was very, very sad stories about that.
So when we come back, do the North Koreans pay the price for that young man eventually losing his life? How? Talk about that next.
Beer graduated just 4 years earlier. As the Hearst Road to
And so, you know, this story of this young man, you know, coming back with neurological problems and passing here. The president said some tough things. You know, I'm not a Trump fan, but I don't blame him for rhetorically trying to muscle North Korea a little bit. But in the end, we're not going to overreact over a lost citizen. Correct?
Well, again, I think it comes back to a couple of things. First, there are 3 American...
I don't mean to disvalue his loss and the symbolism, but really, in the end, what chips are we going to put on the table because of it?
Well, there are still 3 Americans, Korean Americans, being held in North Korea. There's a Canadian and several South Koreans as well, so they still have hostages, if you will.
Well, Dennis Rodman can take care of that, can't he?
Well, that's another story.
Does he have any legitimate play in this thing, Rodman?
No, Rodman, from all that has been said, he was not a part of this at all.
But
that the
Kim
administration, right? They have a close relationship apparently.
Crazy.
It goes back to Kim Jong-un's love of the NBA and the Chicago Bulls in particular. But we also run into the difficulty of options that are available.
What do they want? What do they want? What do the North Koreans want?
Well, I think they want to be recognized as a nuclear weapons state. And they want various concessions from the United States, such as a peace treaty, diplomatic relations, other sorts of aid packages.
Will
perhaps.
we ever give that to them?
Not without any progress towards denuclearization. And so I think what you are starting to see...
How do we denuclearize them when they want nuclear status?
Well, I know, and that is where I think there is a difficulty here of the goals. North Korea, and I think most Korean analysts would say this at this particular point, that North Korea is not going to give up its nuclear program anytime soon.
Tell me about the South Korean president. There's a summit as we speak. This is timely. The Friday, or the middle of this summit. He and Donald Trump are getting to know each other. Relationships matter, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's the two levels here that could be going on during this summit. One is to see how Moon Jae-in and Donald Trump get along personally and what kind of personal relationship, because that matters. I think you are going to see this summit, at least publicly, being relatively light on substance, because there are a lot of crucial issues that will be dealt with at lower levels. But you may see some things being raised in regards to particularly North Korea policy and the free trade agreement that we have. When I was in South Korea last week, there was a great deal of discussion about how these two administrations may get along, and some initial concerns that they were perhaps far apart. But what we kept hearing from the South Korean side, academics and others, is that there may be less difference between Moon and Trump than was believed to be the case a few weeks ago, but we will have to see how that shakes out.
All right, I only got 30 seconds. What's your prognosis on the region and how things are going to go over the next short period of time?
I think we will see tension come down again from what it had been over the spring. But I think the key thing is that we have to do a better job at trying to be able to manage these crises so that we don't have these periodic spikes in tensions.
You think this administration's up to it?
That's going to be difficult.
Is this crowd up to it?
Well, they're going to have as difficult a time as any other administration, and of course it takes two to tango. Right. We need space from the North Korean regime as well.
We appreciate your expertise. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
All right, final word. You got something? You feel better? I think that's a good class. Final word when we come back. Welcome back. Now, if you're watching this originally on Friday, June 30th, yes, July 1st tomorrow. Enjoy the weekend. Know that we're going to take a couple of weeks off from original shows. So for the next 2 weeks, we'll have programs that have previously aired. Now, I wouldn't call it the best of. It's just, some good shows, Happy 4th.